Thank you for this very nice introduction, and thanks for inviting me to the Bethe-Colloquium. It's a great honor to speak in a colloquium named after Hans Bethe. And as Hans Peter just suggested, Bethe, without knowing, that's one of the things I want to show you, was somehow the first string theorist in 1931. And he himself kind of didn't pay that much attention to it, but as you will see in the way that he kind of founded the subject. So when I was starting to prepare this talk, I was actually looking to try to understand the connection of Bonn and Bethe. And I Googled, and I guess I would find lots of important papers that were written here. I kind of failed. But then I found, I guess, what I should take sort of as a hint. I mean, in your, on your homepage, I think you claim, or you say that the Bethe Center is a center for interdisciplinary research, or forum for interdisciplinary research. And I guess Bethe is an excellent exponent of that as a forum of very interdisciplinary research. In that sense, I think it's an ideal name for a center. So if there's another connection, of course, I'm happy to get informed about that after. I should have asked you before. Anyway, so it's this spirit of sort of interdisciplinary research that's also kind of really underlying what I'm going to tell you in the next hour or so. I mean, hopefully about an hour. So I'll start for the next 10 minutes or so to explain you the title. I mean, the combination of words that I put together that seemingly come from quite different fields, and I'll give you an outline and proceed. So we'll start with Mesons, and I'll start with a problem in particle physics that is just an example of a type of problem that actually you meet in many different fields of physics. So in fact, you can say that goes back to, I mean, let's say experimental observations in the 60s, where some people studied pion scattering. They observed that there were lots of resonances that could form with higher and higher spin and higher masses. And there was like the desire to find an explanation for that. And in fact, there was also a curious relation that you've probably heard about the spin and the masses. There was some linear relation between them, and that became known as a rigid trajectory. And people tried to look for an explanation for these rigid trajectories. And so that was really the first time when string theory, really as string theory, came into physics in the late 60s, early 70s, as a model of these rigid trajectories. And it really works quite well. As you can understand, the string is sort of a fluctuating object, so you have some kind of linear mass spectrum coming from the vibrations of the string, which could explain all these excitations that you could see in the lab. However, the thing has some natural flaw, I mean, basic flaw, although this is very beautiful. I should say one more thing. Of course, that requires you, so the string has one natural parameter with the string tension, and of course you have to choose the string tension to be of the same energy scale as the masses of the meson resonances that you see in order for that to work. So then, of course, people went on and kind of looked at behavior of strings, and you can easily understand that the strings have a big flaw in trying to explain nature. That is, if you scatter strings at high energies, they have a very soft scattering behavior because they are extended objects. So their scattering amplitudes fall off very, very fast with the energy of the process. And that's not something that is seen in experiments. Okay, so it was kind of this conflict that eventually led people to abandon strings. Of course, then also QCD was established as a serious theory for this kind of physics. And so string theory kind of disappeared for a while, in fact, from physics, more or less. On the other hand, the underlying problem sort of still remains, even with QCD, even if you believe in QCD as a fundamental theory of physics of mesons and so on. There's a problem to derive from it sort of the non-perturbative or strong coupling features, like to derive confinement, even practical problems. I mean, now I guess there's these experiments where you let heavy ions collide and you build like these quark-gluon plasmas, and it's not clear what the coupling constants are, probably strongly and weakly coupled phenomena, but it's very difficult to actually make predictions because there's definitely some strong coupling physics, which is very hard to derive. Even actually in QCD, even if you're just interested in perturbative results quantum corrections to QCDs, it's a difficult problem. It's very hard computations, and there's whole industries that go around that. So somehow the message here is that even if we believe that QCD is a microscopically correct theory, it's very hard to actually understand all the features and all the different phases of QCD of this theory. And this formulation, of course, that's not unique to particle physics. Similar issues exist also for the standard model of many-body systems, which is sort of electrons, I guess, moving in some background potential with Coulomb interaction, or let's say the Hubbard model. You have very similar issues. You have phases with non-perturbative physics, which are very hard to understand. That's always kind of the same thing that you run into. Now, I said before that, so that sort of was related to the mesons. I said before that that string theory had disappeared in the early 70s because of this problem that it would have, like, the scattering amplitudes are just too soft to explain experiments. And it was only a few people that kind of like supported still the idea or played with the idea that string theory in the end had something to say about gauge physics, what we then understood as gauge physics. And that was in particular Toft. I mean, he kind of compared so he did a limit where the number of colors in this QCD would become very large. And he compared the expansion in one of the number of colors with the expansion that you write down when you do string theory. And he saw that they are formally like the same expansion. So that provided, again, fueled the idea that there must be some relation with string theory. So then the other person was Polyakov, who kind of had this idea that this QCD flux tube, sort of the extension of the QCD flux tube, should be seen as a hint for another dimension. Okay? Because what people had done in the old days, of course, they had always put the string in 4 dimensions where QCD was. They had never had the idea that the string could actually be in a different dimension. So, and Polyakov said maybe that was wrong. He had probably very good arguments, was very hard to understand. It was only in 1997 that Malta-Athena kind of made a very concrete proposal out of that idea. And he actually gave an example and a general construction and showed that indeed many 4-dimensional gauge theory, in particular at strong coupling, can be in fact described through a string theory in 5 dimensions. So you had to add another dimension. You will understand in a moment why that is. And then you have a regime, in particular the strongly coupled regime of the gauge theory, sort of with all the non-perturbative physics in principle. That's the one where the string theory becomes weakly coupled. So that's a little bit like in condensed matter. You have high temperature, low temperature expansions, and you have different regimes where they are valid. So it's like this, but in very different types of theories. On one side, you have a gauge theory with particle theory, no gravitation. On the other hand, you have a string theory. Fundamental degrees of freedom are strings. They live in a 5-dimensional curved background that we'll see in a moment. And so they're totally different regimes, but perturbative expansions in some sense of the same theory. That was the belief. And in fact, you can say that led to a certain geometrization of quantum physics. And we'll again see that theme later, that quantum physics as a field sort of, in some sense, has a particularly strong coupling regime. It can be understood in terms of geometry. And again, that's sort of a very fascinating picture that arises from here. So as I said, there was a very concrete examples for this between 4-dimensional supersymmetric Young-Mills theory and strings in ADS5. We'll also see that in a moment. I should also say that the whole, so there were very interesting examples of that. And there was also a general recipe how to build examples. And in the meantime, people have found lots of different examples also to find dual descriptions, geometric or string geometric descriptions of non-relativistic 3-dimensional systems that would be relevant for condensed matter systems like cold atoms or strange metals and things of that sort. Now, the way sort of this 97 conjecture of Malta-Athena came up is, I think, a very beautiful story of how science can actually work together and how very different disciplines actually come together and produce a fantastic new idea. And I'll try to explain that story in the next, about 20 minutes. So now we have seen sort of the 5th dimension. So the claim is somehow that mesons are kind of related to a 5th dimension. You can understand mesons from string theory if you are ready to kind of pass 1 dimension up and to go into 5 dimensions. So where is Bethe and his metals? So the metals in my title are not the strange metals here, but these are Bethe metals. So you probably know that in 1931, I believe, Bethe wrote a paper on the theory of metals that was called, well, Theory of Metals, Part 1, and it was eigenvalues and eigenfunctions of linear atomic chains. And I think that makes it almost obvious what the relation is. You see, when you think of a string, it's basically a linear atomic chain. It looks like lots of, I mean, if you kind of discretize it, okay, you have lots of different pieces, which look like particles, and that are coupled together as a chain, and that makes up a string. And indeed, such objects see a very different geometry from what particles see, and that's, again, this theme. You see, when you have a particle theory, then you know, for instance, the continuum theory of particles, like Maxwell's theory, in order to understand sort of the properties of the theory, you kind of solve classical differential equations, like Maxwell's equations. You look, for instance, for potentials on a certain geometric surface. And so it's all about the theory of solving a Laplacian in some sense. So for string theory, there's a modification. When you do string theory, you have basically lots of coupled particles. And so the Laplacian gets extended by, so this is sort of angular momentum operator. That's a way to write the Laplacian. And here it's kind of coupled system. So these Li's, I would correspond to these different particles, and they're coupled to this kind of interaction. So it's again somehow a linear operator like the Laplacian, but of course it involves many particles, and that's the way how you pass in some sense from, and I'll again make that more precise later, from particle geometry to string geometry. So that's basically considering linear atomic chains. And that was exactly the paper of Bethe, and in fact Bethe for the first time really developed an amazing tool to actually solve problems in such systems analytically. Something that became known later as the Bethe-Ansatz. And so, of course, you can also go to the continuum limit. I did that only to help your eye, that I discretize the string and kind of decompose it into lots of atoms connected. If you discretize, go to the continuum limit, you come to something, not a linear atomic chain or a spin chain, but something called nonlinear Sikka model. But the way you solve these things are more or less similar. So it's the same kind of techniques. Of course, since 1931, there was a lot of time, and a lot of other people have contributed to solving systems of this type. And right now, especially from the 70s, it was a very active development fueled by lots of important physics problems from all sorts of different fields, statistical physics and string theory, that led to this development. So, okay, so that's sort of the overview. Now, so I think I've explained now all the parts of the title. So they were the Mesons, which stand for us for understanding strongly coupled physics in whichever physics field we're in. There are the metals. Well, they're connected through the fifth dimension, basically. So there's the fifth dimension, the promise that string theory can actually say something about these things through this ADS-CFT correspondence, or Malta-Thinnes 97 contribution. And then there is the understanding that basically understanding string theory in these curved backgrounds is something that Bethe started in 31. And that's in his theory of metals. Now I'll give you the plan. The plan is, it's all about closed circles, as you've probably seen. So this closed circle here is the LHC, which is where you explore, of course, the physics of elementary particles. And you explore both like strongly coupled and weakly coupled phenomena. Definitely, you need very high precision computations even there in the QCB sector in order to interpret results. So that's sort of the mesonic picture. Then up here is a string in 5 dimensions, as you can see. It's also closed, but it's kind of wiggled. And down here is Bethe's linear atomic chain or spin chain. And so the plan is we will go along a circle. I'll basically, go from here to there. I have to convince you that strings really have something to do with strongly coupled physics. Okay. Then I'll tell you more about the connection of Bethe and kind of support this proposal that Bethe in some sense was the first string theorist. So I'll tell you more about this connection. And finally, I close the circle and tell you how indeed sort of the equations that come out of Bethe's beautiful Ansatz really appear today in gauge theory computations. Of course, still in sort of simplified gauge theories, but in higher dimensional systems. So in fact, to be totally honest, I'll do it, not go around the circle, but I'll actually start here now and then move here, and then afterwards I move there, and finally I close again. Okay? So that was the introduction. Are there any questions on this? Okay. If that's not the case, I'll take you on a little tour now to to explain, as I said, this connection here. And I think it's a very beautiful story about how different fields of physics actually play together to come up with such a crazy-sounding proposal that 5-dimensional string theories that have something to do with 4-dimensional gauge theory problem, which is without any gravity. Okay, so how can that be? So I'll start basically. Okay, that's just the introduction page. I start with closed strings, and remind you a little bit about closed strings. So I apologize to the string theorists in the audience. Obviously, this will be like too low. I actually don't know. I was kind of pretty sure because of the Arbeitstagung there will be no mathematicians here. But maybe, I mean, so I guess that's true, right? There's no mathematicians. I could probably explain a few things better. I'm safe, good. So I imagine that maybe condensed matter or statistical physics, there might be a few. But so just whenever you have a question, just put forward the question. So the following story, I guess, is like now standard folklore, of course, for string theorists because it was something that happened in the last 15 years, basically. Well, actually, I started sort of in the 80s. So first of all, we just start with closed strings. And as you probably have heard, closed strings like to propagate in high-dimensional spaces. The ones that you can make sense of closed string theories, the strings want to propagate in 10 dimensions. Okay, so that's usually that's just the fact, the mathematical fact. So there's two things I have to tell you about strings. I mean, strings are kind of closed strings that kind of vibrate, and of course there are two fundamental parameters there. One parameter is the fundamental tension. Okay. And or the string length, the natural length of the string. So that is this parameter Ls, the string length. And then you have basically only one coupling constant because all the strings can do is to kind of, two strings can combine into one string and separate again. There's nothing else. Even if you had some kind of, 4-point coupling, I guess this is a loop diagram, but a 4-point coupling like this, you can always decompose it into these three valent vertices. And so there's only one coupling constant in the theory. So you can recall that basically there's only two parameters. There's the string length parameter that kind of describes the tension of that string, and that in the old days, people wanted to kind of put at the mass of mesons, if you wanted to do meson physics. And then later, of course, was moved to the Planck scale. And then there's the string coupling. So when you know how to model this mathematically, you can actually compute scattering amplitudes in string theory, and you can compute them in particular the massless. There's kind of lots of, I mean, you can think of string theory as basically consisting of an infinite tower of massive particles corresponding to the various vibrational modes of the string. So you can compute the scattering amplitude in particular of the massless objects in the theory, and they will reproduce theories which are pan-dimensional supersymmetric versions of Einstein gravity in some sense with some extra fields. Okay, so there's a way that's, I guess, something, again, you can read in everywhere in New York Times, that you get supergravity from string theory at low energy. So that's common folklore. Let's move that a little further. So again, I mean, this whole story is just in terms of pictures, and we will later, it will be kind of amazing that actually there's some real solid science behind. But only that's the reason why I'm telling you that. So suppose now we have gravity. And of course, when you have gravity like Einstein gravity, the next thing that you do is, and what people did also in the old days of Einstein gravity, was to look for special solutions like black hole solutions. That's, again, a simple field. I mean, gravity is like a field theory. You have differential equations describing the fields, gravitational field and whatever Maxwell fields things you have in the theory, and you look for kind of similar to the Schwarzschild solution, like solutions of this type. Okay. Now, because you're not in 4 dimensions but in 10 dimensions here, you can probably imagine that there's many more species of many more solutions of this type. In fact, you cannot only have like point-like black holes, like the ones that we know from our universe, but in a 10-dimensional world, you can also have black objects that are extended along lines or walls, and so can have all sorts of dimensions. And so you can write down solutions. It's a nice theory. In particular, you can find extremal solutions which are stable, and they run under the name. So these are solitonic solutions of these classical partial differential equations, which run under the name of branes. So So that's just telling you that, of course, using the standard physics knowledge that you have, you can find these funny objects in a higher dimensional, 10-dimensional universe described by 10-dimensional supergravity. But now we understand, of course, when we are doing string theory, this 10-dimensional supergravity is actually low energy approximation of a full string theory. So we will have to try to embed these solitonic, these extremely black holes, in some sense, or black objects, into string theory. And so that will actually, the attempt of doing that will actually teach us something about the structure of these objects. In order to explain that, let's do a Gedanken experiment, and let's put like one of these one of these brains in our universe, any kind of dimension, and let's imagine that in this universe we now have another massive particle that propagates through this universe. And of course, because of the gravitational interaction, this black object here is, of course, a gravitational object. It will exchange, well, the graviton in particular, or other mediators of interaction. So this is sort of the particle picture. So this thing comes in from here, moves up, then eventually exchanges like a graviton or a photon with this object here, and then it's deflected and moves out. In string, of course, it looks the same. There's a closed string mode. That could be any kind of massive closed string mode. It moves. Eventually, it kind of interacts with one of these, for instance, massless graviton modes sent out from the brain, and gets deflected and moves out. But there's a different way to look at the same picture. If you take it as a picture in string theory, you can see actually here a closed string coming in. And eventually, you see it looks like this closed string opens up and becomes an open string with both ends on the brain. And then later, it closes again and is sent off. So that's a different description of the same process. Now we would say the closed string falls in onto this brain and excites the brain. There's an excited state of the brain formed, which is described by an open string that propagates along the brain. Later, this excited state decays again, and you have a closed string that is sent off and the unexcited brain left behind. So in order for this second description to make sense, of course, you need that D-branes. You understand that D-branes in string theory are actually objects on which open strings can end. And then it's exactly this brain with an open string that ends on it that describes the excited states of the brain. So we got open strings in the picture. Okay, so these are just the excited states of these brains in string theory. You can't see that in the particle limit, but once you promote it to string theory, these objects have excited excitations, and they are described by open strings. Now, once you have open strings, you can again wonder, so we started with closed strings. We understood at low energy, closed strings behave like gravitons and things like that. So you can now ask the same question once you have open strings, and you go to very low energy and look at their scattering behavior. What do they look like? Do they look like particles that we have seen maybe in our world? And so again, that's a famous result from old result in string theory. In fact, to make it slightly more general, I now take several of these black objects and put them together in a linear array of these things. It turns out that you can also do that in a stable way if you make them all parallel. And then you have open strings that describe the excitation of this linear array of black objects or brains by open strings that have one end on one brain and another end potentially on a different brain. So these brains I will number by color A, and that runs from 1 to n. And so I guess in that sense, these open strings that describe the excitations of this array of brains are bicolored objects. They carry two color indices related to the two ends. So in this theory, again, you use the rules of string theory to compute the scattering amplitudes. And, well, what you'll find is that they behave more or less like non-abelian gauge bosons, and depending on the precise configuration that you choose of brains, you can also get all sorts of interesting matter. I'm sure you have seen that before. So these theories, I should point out, of course, since the open strings have their ends on the brain, these objects here can only move along the brain. So they don't move in the 10-dimensional universe, but only along the volume of these brains. But since we are in 10-dimensional, these solutions can be extended objects with p-spatial directions. So these brains here have a p+1 dimensional volume. And so you get theories on p+1 dimensional, and p you can essentially dial. So you can make p3, then you get 4-dimensional gauge theories sitting inside this 10-dimensional universe. So it's kind of quite amazing. I mean, of course, again, we started only with closed strings, and we discussed gravity, and sort of through the back door, now we understood that the theory automatically contains open strings. Okay, and in fact, gauge theories could have been discovered that way. Of course, they weren't. But So what can we do with this? And in order to understand the potential of this development, let me carry you through another Gedanken experiment. For this, we will actually put two of these brains in our 10-dimensional universe, and we keep them at some distance, okay? And we'll look at their interaction. So, of course, what they will do is they will start to interact by exchange of, graviton modes and other modes, Maxwell fields, and so on and so forth, whatever is around. And so there will be gravitation attraction, maybe some repulsion from other effects, and so on and so forth. So that's the picture here. So we have these two brains here. And so they interact now by exchange of these objects. Of course, these objects are now generally closed string modes. So we understand that they interact by exchange of closed string modes, which could be sort of the massless closed string modes, the graviton, the Maxwell field, things like that. So when these two objects are very, very far apart, then of course, I mean, among all these massive string modes that you have, only the massless modes will actually significantly contribute to this process, because the massive carriers of interaction will have a very short range of interaction, and so they're not very important for this process. So if you want to understand the interaction of these brains at long distance, you can actually do the computation just in the massless sector and just use the graviton modes, I mean the degrees of freedom of the supergravity theory, the massless modes of the theory, in order to understand the interaction. However, when you bring these objects very, very close together, then of course the distance becomes, the distance becomes small, and of course then you have to actually take into account the whole tower of excitations of the closed string in order to get a sensible answer for the interaction of these things, okay? But now we understand, we do the same trick that we had before. We actually reinterpret this picture in terms of open strings. You can also think of it as an open string diagram where a pair of open strings forms here at the bottom, then they propagate for a while, and then they annihilate up here, okay? So that looks like a open string vacuum amplitude. So it's a quantum effect, quantum process. And so now you see that this interpretation, so if we have these two brains at finite distance, more or less it's equivalent. You can either here sum over all these closed string modes, or switch to this picture and compute this open string vacuum amplitude, and you would get the same answer. So on this side, of course, you would add the sum over all intermediate open string modes. And if the brains are at some finite distance, then of course all these open string modes, even the massive ones, would play a role. But of course, as you bring these brains closer and closer together, you see the massive open string modes in some sense have to travel a long distance before they recombine. And so in that regime, when the brains are brought very close together, only the massless open string modes would actually have significant contribution to the process. So the computation, if you bring these things close together, will actually simplify drastically when you bring these things close together, because you can restrict to basically the massless modes, which is just the standard gauge theory. So you understand from this discussion that these two pictures basically, I mean, this problem of computing interaction between these brains has two different regimes. There's a regime when the brains are very far apart, which is where it's smarter to actually do a gravitational computation. And then when you go to the regime where the brains are very close together, then the gravitational computation would have to be replaced by a full string theory computation, which is difficult. And you see that, in fact, it should be equivalent. It should better be approximated by some kind of gauge theory computation, which can be performed by some gauge theory computation in that regime. So there's a few interesting things that you learn from here. First thing, so there's an equivalence. So if you're, of course, the other way around, if you have a gauge theory computation, you're on this side here, you can in principle rewrite that as a string theory computation of strings moving in 10 dimensions. So there's a few things that you learn from here. First of all, remember these closed strings, they still propagate in 10 dimensions. Okay, so in order to do a gauge theory computation here of a gauge theory, let's suppose that these are now D3 brains, so they are spanned over three-dimensional, have a three-dimensional space-dimensional Volt volume or four-dimensional space-time Volt volume. Then you have here a gauge theory in 3 + 1 dimensions, sort of a quantum system, non-gravitational quantum system in 3 + 1 dimensions, for which we want to do a computation. In principle, you understand from this picture that you can do this computation by switching to the string side if you're ready to take all the string effects into account. But these strings here, of course, move in 10 dimensions. They don't move in the initial 4 dimensions. So dimension has changed, okay? So although we have a gauge theory here in 4 dimensions, the strings that are involved in this computation move in 10 dimensions, and they move in the geometry that is created by these brains in the theory. There's another lesson you can learn from here, is that on this side we have a loop effect, a quantum effect on the open string or gauge theory side. On this side it's just a tree-level exchange. So this rewriting does not preserve loop orders. So quantum gauge theory computation can be expressed through classical string theory computation and vice versa. Okay? Now, so that's sort of the picture, and that's sort of the physics explanation of this duality that was proposed by Maltesina, that I'll review in a moment. Okay. So there was a very concrete example that was put forward in 97. In fact, if you take some of these D3 brains, I mean three-dimensional object with 4-dimensional Wald volume, and put them together, n of them together, you can actually compute which gauge theory you get on these objects that describes the excitation of these things. And these are some supersymmetric versions of pure gauge theory. So it's called n equals 4, 4-dimensional super Yang-Mills theory. Not so important what the details of the theory is. It has very high supersymmetry. Has, of course, U and C gauge field. And then in addition to that, 6 scalars. I don't think I'll need that anymore. And on the other side, so the claim is if you want to do computation on this side, so in fact I switched sides now. This would be on the right-hand side of the previous slide. So the previous slide tells us that alternatively we can actually do a computation with closed strings in a geometry that is near basically to these branes. So of course these branes curve space-time as in any gravitational theory, so it's a curved geometry. And you can work out what the metric of this geometry is that is created by the effect of these branes. And you'll find that near these branes basically is what is called an ADS5 cross S5 geometry. S5 you all know. ADS5, I don't think I will have to actually really tell you. It's some kind of 5-dimensional non-compact geometry that has constant curvature. And so that describes basically the regime in particular, like near these branes. So the claim is that you can take your favorite gauge theory computation of whatever quantity you're interested in and in principle translate it into a closed string theory computation. So the first thing is, of course, you have to compare the parameters. The parameters on the gauge theory side. So there's 2 parameters now. There's the coupling constant of this is a non-abelian gauge field, so it has self-coupling. So there's a coupling constant G Yang-Mills attached to that, or in this context of, we multiply that with the number of colors and form what is called the 't Hooft coupling. And then there is the number of colors. That's the second parameter. And so on the other side, I told you before, there's 2 parameters in the story. There's a string length of the tension of the string on one hand, and then there's a string coupling. And so the relation between these quantities is given by these formulas. So what you see here is that, so I should have said that before, these ADS5 and S5, they have, of course, a curvature radius. They have actually the same, the absolute value of the curvature radius is the same. So that's one fundamental geometric parameter on this side. So from this curvature radius on this side here, you can actually form a dimensionless quantity by taking the quotient with the string length. So this is a dimensionless quantity that is claimed to be to agree with this coupling constant in the gauge theory. And so that tells you that small coupling, of course, corresponds then to a very small radius, and that is to a very, very strongly curved space. Okay? Whereas large coupling here corresponds to a very large space where basically string effects, like weakly curved space, where string effects are not that important. And so that's kind of the geometric regime where you can just approximate gauge theory, string theory by just gravity. So then you can go on. There's a long dictionary. So basically all the objects that you have in gauge theory, they correspond to something on the string theory side. Every computation in the gauge theory corresponds to some computation in the string theory side. For instance, gauge invariant operators correspond to closed string states. Then the so-called scaling dimension, anomalous dimension on the gauge theory side, if you don't know what that is, don't bother, correspond to the mass of the string mode, and so on and so forth. Okay? So this may seem somewhat surprising, but as I'll convince you at the end of the talk, only if you haven't seen it before, it actually has now reached a status where it actually has like undergone lots of very serious tests, and in fact, it's been developed into a very useful technology. I'll show you that later. But of course, when it first appeared, and I guess in 97, I think it was, I mean, I first heard about it, in fact, in 97 from Maldaschena at a conference at CERN. It was my first ever string theory conference I attended, and I remember that people were quite skeptical and thought this cannot possibly be true. And I think Polchinski once said that, I mean, if there's the slightest hint that this is not obviously wrong, it must be true because it's so crazy, okay? Anyway, I hope I'll give you more evidence for this and, as we proceed. Let me just summarize this part with the following picture. So this is what we have looked at. So we've looked at gauge theory, or again, I mean, you can replace that by other systems, quantum systems, if you're from a different field. And so I gave you gauge theory, basically a toy example of gauge theory has just two parameters, which is the 't Hooft coupling, or the coupling, fundamental coupling, on the number of colors. So this diagram here in this direction would be the quantum effects in the gauge theory, and this would be enhancing the number of colors. So in the gauge theory, somehow this computation, increasing the number of colors in the computation, is not such a big deal. Of course, going down here in this regime and studying quantum effects requires some, right now, still kind of Feynman diagrams. That's very difficult to pursue, and maybe some of the processes that we deal with, for instance, in heavy ion collisions, are somewhere here in this picture, okay? But then I told you that there's a different interpretation of that same picture, okay? When you want to look at it from the eyes of a string theorist, what you see is the following. You see a string theory that also has two parameters, the string, the string coupling, and then, of course, the scale, and the mass scale or the tension of the string, or rather the dimensionless coupling string lengths over the natural length scale of the geometry that you're working with. And so, so now the string theory here, so gravity is up here, and this classical gravity is up here. So as you go down here, you basically, string effects become more and more important. So the string length becomes larger and larger. That means measured on the, with respect to the natural scale of the geometry. So the string effects from here become more and more important. So here you have really dealing with classical string geometry. Okay, it's a modification of geometry that is classical string geometry. Down here, of course, are the string quantum effects that are weighted by the loop counting parameter GS. So in this regime down here, you have, for instance, string quantum gravity. Okay, up here, as I said, there's a string classical geometry, and here is just classical geometry. So, so that tells you that this regime up here, of course, is particularly simple because it's just classical geometry. It's a theory of partial differential equations, complicated though. But you can study this and learn a lot about physics in this regime, which, if you believe this correspondence, tells you something about very strongly coupled, infinitely coupling gauge theory. And if you are actually able to move along this line, you can interpolate all the way from strong coupling to weak coupling in the multicolor limit. And that is, of course, the field of string theory. So you leave, of course, the geometric regime here and go to string geometry. And then if you go down, so this direction, in fact, through string theory is sort of the direction of the string theory diagram that is under reasonably good control. And this is where Bethe will come in a moment. So on string theory side, this direction is actually the one that is complicated. The string loop effects, of course, are also very complicated, even more complicated than in gauge theory. So, so in that sense, it's very interesting, this complementarity of the difficulties of this picture. You see that for gauge theory, this direction was complicated, which is somewhat from string theory's point of view, the easy direction, comparatively easy direction, whereas this direction from the gauge theory point of view is sort of the easier direction, which in the hard direction for string theory. Okay? So this is a picture of physics that I wanted to show you, and that's sort of the story that I wanted to tell you about how this gauge-string duality first came up, and I think it's a very beautiful picture. To see how different fields, particle physics, gravitation, lots of mathematics came together in order to produce this interesting idea. And again, you may not be convinced yet that this is actually kind of true, but we'll probably, hopefully get there later. So this brings me to the end of the first part. I now explained the connection between the LHC and strings in 5 dimensions. So now we come to the second part. I have to switch gears. We have to understand how we now do string theory and what that has to do with Bethe's theory of metals. So that's the next thing. I could have also called that strings and linear atomic chains. And the basic idea, of course, you have seen before, but I want to be a little bit more precise about that. So I told you before that in order to actually get this to work and learn something about gauge theory, in particular, in order to move along this top line and interpolate between strong coupling and weak coupling in the multicolor limit, you have to understand string geometry. Now, you can ask, what is string geometry? And in fact, I'll try to give you 3 different answers on the next 3 transparencies, and then explain how you actually do string geometry. So when you have, as I said very early, when you have a particle that moves on a circle, sort of the geometry of that circle is basically encoded, as you know, in the eigenvalue spectrum of the Laplacian on the circle, which is very easy to compute. Basically, all the particle can do is can move with momentum n around the circle. Momentum is discretized, and what you get is a spectrum that is n squared over r squared. And you can form actually this kind of partition function that encodes basically information about the geometry of the circle. It contains all the eigenvalues of the Laplacian on the circle. So I don't want to enter into this can you hear the shape of the drum discussion, but roughly, I mean, we identify now so we have at least a lot of information about the geometry in this quantity. Now, the string replaces this quantity by a new quantity, sort of that can code string geometry. And you can sort of, from just intuition, more or less, you can understand what this will be like. If you have a string that moves on a circle of radius r, it actually can do 2 things. It can move around that circle, okay? And of course, it can also wind around the circle, okay? And so as it moves around the circle, we'll have energy n squared over r squared as a particle. And if it stretches around the circle, it will have an energy that is proportional to r squared, to the length squared, and of course, to the number of times it winds around. And then on top of that, the string can also fluctuate, okay? It can oscillate, and all these oscillations are part of the spectrum, okay? So, and there's a counting function that encodes that, and that's given here. You see, you recognize this piece here from particle theory, but then you have an extra piece that takes into account that the string can also wind around that circle. And then down here, you get all the contributions from the oscillations. So that's what is sort of encoding the geometry of a string, and has lots of the string C's of a circle, okay? So, and that has lots of interesting features that are very different from particle theory. There's something that's called T-duality and things like that. So there's a different geometry, which at large r, it looks more or less the same as particle geometry, but as you go to small r, has lots of new effects. Now, so this was one way of discussing it. And you can now ask, okay, here, this partition function that I wrote down encoded information about the spectrum of this Laplacian. So is there a Laplacian that basically produces, whose spectrum is encoded by this function that we kind of just build it by hand now, just using our geometric intuition? And there is. In fact, the easiest way to state this Laplacian, it's actually in some sense, I have to make that more precise in a moment, it's what's known as the anisotropic spin 1/2 Heisenberg magnetic chain, okay? So I'm sure you have all seen that in statistical physics lectures. So basically you build a spin chain, a one-dimensional spin chain, where you put like fundamental degrees of freedom is basically you can have, a two-dimensional vector space for each individual spin. On these two-dimensional vector spaces, you have Pauli matrices acting, sigma x, y, and z. And then you couple neighboring spins through this Hamiltonian, which is known as Heisenberg spin chain. So I've put in here an extra, so often, the isotropic one would be without that parameter delta. So I put in this extra parameter delta that reduces the symmetry. Of course, without this parameter delta, this is perfectly symmetric in x, y, and z, so there's an SU2 symmetry. But if you put this parameter delta, put in the coupling to this Hamiltonian, then you reduce the symmetry to just an SO2 or U1 symmetry, okay? So then you can look at this. It's a problem. You make a finite chain, okay? You have this is a concrete matrix of dimension 2 to the 2 to the L. You can look at the eigenvalue spectrum. and look at the low-lying spectrum. It's a very concrete problem. You can start to make the string, the length larger and larger, and try to see whether the spectrum sort of stabilizes. I mean, it should, of course, not, like as you make the chain larger, there should be some stabilization, at least in the low-lying spectrum. And in fact, you can find a beautiful spectrum when you take this kind of large L limit. That, of course, depends on delta. And that's exactly the spectrum that is sort of encoded in this formula on this transparency. So I guess condensed matter theorists know that sort of the low energy limit of this chain is basically theory of a Luttinger liquid, which is the same as the compactified free boson. And this parameter delta here is essentially related to the radius parameter. So that's the one that allows you to tune the radius of your geometry. So in that sense, so you can do that numerically, but now is where Bethe comes in. It actually turns out that this model you can also solve analytically through this Bethe Ansatz. And in particular, in the thermodynamic limit, you get nice equations that control the spectrum of this theory through some kind of nonlinear integral equation. That's sort of a standard thing. I'll show you one probably a little later. There's a standard type of equation that always comes up when you want to write down equations that describe the spectrum of these theories. But so the message is that you should take from here is that basically this problem of string geometry is really a problem of a spectrum of a chain. In fact, in this case, it's the anisotropic Heisenberg net that reproduces the string on R2. I think since I'm a little short in time, I want to promise you three different ways to think about string geometry. I skipped the third one. I think you have now seen my main message. So the string geometry is actually encoded in the spectrum of such magnets. And if you're just interested in the string geometry of a circle, you use the Heisenberg magnet. But of course, we're not interested in the string geometry of a circle, but we are interested in the string geometry of, well, AdS5 cross S5. So, and you can see, of course, that the Heisenberg magnet is not the right system from symmetries. I told you before, I mean, the circle has, of course, a U1 symmetry, as has this anisotropic Heisenberg magnet. But the gauge theory or the string theory that we are discussing has, of course, the same symmetries as the gauge theory. So the gauge theory I told you like much earlier was actually n equals 4 superior mils, and you can look at the space-time symmetries of this theory. Has a lot of supersymmetry, and of course also lots of space-time symmetries. It's a scale-invariant conformal theory, so it has what's known as PSU4/4 symmetry. It's this big supersymmetry that contains all the Lorentz transformations and in addition scaling transformations, and then also super. So of course, in order to do string geometry that is relevant for this problem, for n equals 4 superior Mills theory, you need to study a magnet, a Heisenberg magnet that has the same symmetry. If you're in the wrong symmetry type, you can never learn something. So that basically tells you the only thing that you have to make different now is in order to, if you want to kind of use Bethe's technology to apply that to gauge theory computations in some sense, you have to take these fundamental spin degrees of freedom and make them sort of live in superspaces with the right symmetries. And you have to write down Hamiltonians with the right symmetries that preserve the right symmetries. So if you want to do it for n equals 4, it has to be PSU4/4 symmetry. If you want to discuss, for instance, a system that has some non-relativistic Schrödinger symmetry, then you have to use a spin chain where the spins sit in a non-relativistic Schrödinger symmetry, and so on and so forth. Okay? So anyway, whatever you do, you will end up with kind of interesting spin chains, and then you use the tools that are provided, or you develop new tools, but that were started to be developed by Bethe in 31. And these are the tools of one-dimensional linear atomic chains or metals. So the main conclusion from this discussion is that the toolkit of string geometry is really the toolkit of one-dimensional quantum system. And the first tool, very significant tool that was put into this toolkit was actually the Bethe Ansatz in 1931. And then, of course, many other tools joined, and this is an active field that continues to be developed. Now, you see, I've discussed two things, and I think at this point you may not be convinced that they are kind of related. So I've talked about one-dimensional spin chains and their relation on string geometry, somehow convincing story. I've also related I guess, the gauge theory physics to string theory. But can we actually see a direct relation between the gauge theory and these metals, I mean the one atomic chains? So if that is true, then we should see all the equations that appear in the system of one-dimensional metals, linear atomic chains, they should actually appear in gauge theory, okay? So we should expect that we see, in particular, this nonlinear integral equation that describes sort of beta ansatz in the thermodynamic limit when you make the chain very large. You should see the same nonlinear integral equation describing quantities in four-dimensional gauge theory, okay? And so the purpose of my last 5 minutes is, maybe even 10 because of the long introduction that I had, is to show you some of the recent developments, very concrete developments where exactly that happens, where exactly these nonlinear integral equations that were before only known from one-dimensional quantum system actually now characterize gauge theory quantities of relatively easy interpretation. Okay? So in fact, I should say there's various contexts in which that appears. In fact, the first problem was the so-called spectral problem, where you just try to compute the spectrum of anomalous dimension or scaling dimension of operators in n equals 4. These are described indeed by some nonlinear integral equations, and they have been tested against gauge theory computation to very high loop order. And it's amazing how these nonlinear integral equations work on that problem. You basically plug in sort of the operator that you're interested in your gauge theory, so that at 3 seconds, okay? That kind of determines some terms in this nonlinear integral equation that describe this operator. Then you put this nonlinear integral equation on a computer, and you compute the scaling dimension as a function of the coupling, all the way from weak coupling to strong coupling. You can check that the first few terms exactly agree with the gauge theory computations. And of course, large coupling agrees with classical gravity results for string theory results. I actually decided to give you another example, not this problem of anomalous dimensions, but one of scattering amplitudes. First of all, because it's sort of the more recent development, and second, because it actually will see sort of all three aspects. You will see the geometry. I mean, the gauge theory problem is easy to understand. You'll see the geometry, the geometric formulation, and then the nonlinear integral equation. And they come all kind of really nicely together. So actually, I forgot to make the title page for this. So we're now sort of on my plan picture. We are on the lower part, right? I'm trying to connect back from the metals to the LHC. So the problem, I probably won't explain everything on this slide, but the problem is a standard problem when you have like particles of a gauge theory, like in this case gluons, and you want to scatter. And you want to compute the scattering amplitudes. And of course, these scattering amplitudes, so here's a picture of like 2 gluons coming in, 2 going out. They are parameterized, well, I mean, by certain parameters called the Mandelstam variables, which are sort of the invariance, kinematical invariance of this process. And so it's an obvious physics problem that you would be interested in doing this for like 4 gluons or 5 or 6 or whatever. And a few years back, there was actually conjecture by Baron, Dixon, and Smirnov for what this amplitude should look like. In fact, it has sort of a tree-level part that is, I mean, non-quantum classical part that is easy to calculate. It also has a divergent part that you can construct, I mean, using, it's known. And so the main thing is to compute this so-called finite remainder function. And these people here, just doing gauge theory, made a proposal for what this thing is, okay? So this is actually, the claim was it was a one-loop answer, like one-loop quantum computation multiplied with a constant that needed, I mean, that was an all-loop effect. And this constant, in fact, was one of the quantities that was computed only by string theory. So using the string theory results, you had a proposal for this amplitude, okay? So initially they said, okay, this formula should somehow work for any number of gluons. So then came the next question. So the main thing is this formula is meant to be an all-loop answer, okay? It only puts in one-loop information, but with this coefficient here, the claim was that it becomes an all-loop answer. So it would consider all the quantum corrections, sum all the quantum correction to this amplitude, okay? So of course, according to what I told you before, it's now natural if we believe that we have actually, for strongly coupled theory, we have a string description, then we should be able to test this proposal at strong coupling in the geometric regime, where we have description in terms of strings in ADS. And that's what Alde-Malterthena proposed. And so here's sort of the geometric formulation of the same problem. It's quite kind of funny, and I will not go through an explanation how that comes up. But when you have these scattering amplitudes, all these gluons come in with a certain momentum. And since they are massless, their momenta are light-like. So their prescription was the following. So I didn't tell you much about ADS, but what you have to know right now is that ADS basically has a boundary that looks like Minkowski space, and then extends the fifth dimension you can think of just filling up with such a cylinder. Okay? So out here on the boundary is Minkowski space. So their proposal was the following. What you take is you take the kinematical information of the process that you want to study, like you take the momenta of these gluons, and you form from these gluons, by taking the first gluon momentum P1, P2, you just form a polygon out of these things. Okay? So all these things are light-like vectors, and you just build a polygon from these light-like momentum vectors. Okay? And then you can think that you have a bubble or a surface that kind of you force to be on the boundary along this polygon. Think of a soap bubble that you kind of span into like a polygon-shaped wire. And you know now that, of course, there's in the center somehow, there's sort of the gravitational pull from this brane. So this soap bubble will actually hang inside this ADS5 space. And it's a minimal area problem. And the claim was of Alde-Malterthena was that the minimal area of this surface is actually the amplitude at large coupling. Okay? So they went ahead, they computed for 4 gluons this area. You can construct a surface, compute the area. And indeed, it matches with the BDS formula. Okay? So it really, this amplitude at large coupling has a geometric interpretation. It's an area of a bubble that hangs from in that case, from this kind of 4 polygon, I don't know, fourgon, I guess, or whatever, into the bulk. Okay? But of course, they went further and they said, okay, we can do this in principle also. I mean, okay, so they tried to do it for 5 and 6 and 7 and check all the other predictions. Eventually, they managed to do it for a very special configuration of infinite number of gluons, and they found disagreement with the BDS formula. And then later, people went back, looked at, so that basically said BDS formula must be wrong, or IDS CFT is wrong. So then later, people went back to gauge theory computation. They understood that BDS formula actually is fundamentally wrong. It doesn't have the right analytic properties of a local field theory. So you can understand that even without ever thinking about string theory, you can understand that the answer wasn't right. But for 4 and 5 gluons, it's right. So it's only starting from 6 gluons that's not right, and that needs to be corrected. And so the string theory side was the first side where this was detected. And you can understand it entirely in terms of string theory. But the problem was that still the surface, I mean, you would now want to go to 6 gluons, the first case, which is not clear. And you would like to solve this problem, compute this minimal surface for 6 gluons, and then compute the area and use that as a prediction for the correct answer for gluon scattering. But it turned out it was very hard to find these surfaces. Okay? It's a geometric problem, but even geometric problems can be very hard. It's not only string theory problems. So then came a very beautiful reformulation of the problem. So right now we're doing geometry, and now comes a reformulation that brings in nonlinear integral equations of the type that appear in Bethe's metals. So that was a paper by Alde, Gaiotto, Malterthena, and it's a very beautiful piece of mathematics, in fact, that's underlying this. It's a reformulation of a geometrical problem in a certain class of geometrical problem through an interesting nonlinear integral equation. So I'll not give you many details here, but so roughly the procedure is the following. So I mostly wrote this out here for 6 gluon case. And the 6 gluon case, in fact, turns out that there's 3 important kinematical invariants. So this is kind of the shape of these nonlinear integral equations that I was talking about all the time. So you have here, it's a one-dimensional integral, and you're trying to find a function y, okay, this function y. And what's known as this kernel function here in this integral. And what you put in are certain parameters here, okay, in this driving term. So the way you do this now is, so once you have your function y, you can actually compute the the area of the surface from that function y, and that is the scattering amplitude through the lower formula. And so you put in the y into this formula and compute some quantity, and this is basically just a correction to the BDS formula. I told you BDS was incorrect, so it basically gives you, in spirit, this formula here gives you sort of the correct area. Now, so the way you do that is you take your kinematical information about your momenta, you feed that into these coefficients here, these three numbers in this case. So these coefficients here, in fact, are more or less fixed by the symmetries, and then you compute, when you solve for this function y, numerically if you want, you plug that in here and you get the area, okay? So that's how you do this. But in fact, this is exactly a type of equation, as I said before, that appears in the theory of metals. It's sort of the form of a thermodynamic Bethe-Ansatz. In that case, of course, these parameters M are fundamental couplings of these and mass parameters of this one-dimensional quantum system. This kernel function is again fixed somehow by the symmetries of the problem. It's mostly algebraic features. And this y is sort of related to some density of some kind of quasi-particle excitation in the system. And you try to adjust them such that sort of the energy energy is minimized. And so again, you compute the free energy of the system through this type of equations. Yes? Yeah, so that's true. So this is a fair criticism. I told you there's actually a very, very beautiful piece of math that brings it in here. So in the context of, I'm happy to explain more about this, okay? But it's naturally a very mathematical discussion. What I wanted to show, we should not be surprised that TBA appears here, because we understand that TBA, okay, describes one-dimensional quantum system, and the problem that we are trying to address, namely the gauge theory problem, is a problem in string theory and then hence in one-dimensional quantum systems. So we should expect TBA-like equations to appear in this problem. Indeed, I did not really explain where this TBA equation came from. And in fact, you would, of course, laugh, I guess, if I told you now the spin chain for which this is sort of the TBA equation. So there's no microscopic derivation of this equation. So that's sort of the flaw in the discussion. But still, this equation is one that you're very familiar, and especially you're very familiar with. It's an equation that people have a lot of experience with from one-dimensional quantum systems, and it appears in this problem. And indeed, I was hiding sort of the explanation. And the explanation is, in some sense, still a bit indirect. Of course, in the long run, I'm sure it will actually be derived from this kind of theory of microscopic theory of metals. But at the moment, there's a more indirect way that actually comes through n-2 gauge theories and wall crossing and things of that type. So it's a beautiful piece of math, actually, very deep also. But it comes in from still another side, which kind of adds to the flavor of the whole discussion of how interdisciplinary this subject is. So the last part has been very, very short, obviously. I came to the end of my talk. If you want to hear more about this, I advertise that we'll have a workshop about this development. Is actually a very topical field with lots of recent developments where sort of string computations and string-inspired resummations actually engage theory, and also string theory computations on strongly coupled gauge theory amplitudes. So that brings me to the end. Let me just summarize that I've now completed our circle. So we discussed briefly sort of how gauge physics, in particular strongly coupled gauge physics, is related to strings. So I remind you that strings have to live now in 5 dimensions in order to describe 4-dimensional physics. And I guess I should say that in the very end, you should understand. In the beginning, I told you strings can have nothing to do with gauge theory because of this problem that their scattering is too soft to describe field theory. So the way, of course, this is now avoided, you might have seen that before, is that if you have strings in 4 dimensions, you have to once dial sort of the string tension. And it's one number which you put MEV if you want to describe meson resonances. And then you get this very soft behavior. But of course, now these strings live in 5 dimensions, and there's gravitational redshift due to the presence of these branes. So the string tension is no longer a constant, but it's a parameter that changes with the distance from the brane. So there's a regime where actually the string tension is Planck scale, and there's a regime where the string tension is of the order of the masses of meson resonances. The 5th dimension is absolutely crucial to make this work. So we've seen this part. I've tried to convince you that really Bethe was the first string theorist, the one that really laid the foundations of the field. Strings are basically one-dimensional linear chains if you go to the continuum. And finally, I try to convince you that, that these formulas that we know from one-dimensional quantum systems are actually beginning to appear in real gauge theory problems. Okay, I close here.